The diencephalon forms this central core of the brain, superior to the midbrain of the brainstem and surrounded by the cerebrum. The diencephalon, which the word diencephalon actually means two brains, but there's actually three components of the diencephalon: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The thalamus we're going to talk about first. The thalamus, the word thalamus means inner chamber, and it makes up the majority of the diencephalon. It's comprised of two bodies, two oval bodies that are connected in the center by what's called the intermediate mass. And it's a lot larger than this picture would show because you've only cut through the center of it, and the thalamus has the two masses more lateral. So when you do a mid-sagittal section, you don't quite see the entire thalamus. You just see the central intermediate mass. Thalamus has a number of functions. What it's known mostly for is a sensory relay center, or often called a gateway to the cerebral cortex. So what happens is most, not all, but most of the sensory information coming into the brain, whether it be up the brain stem into the thalamus or by cranial nerves that attach to the brain, most of that sensory input goes to the thalamus. And then what the thalamus knows is where it ultimately needs to go in what's called the cerebral cortex, which is going to be this larger outer part of the brain. The one exception is olfaction. Olfaction is typically the one we emphasize as not needing the thalamus, if you will. It can go right to the olfactory region of the cerebral cortex. All the other senses, if you think about pain, when you hurt yourself, those pain impulses go to the thalamus and then get relayed up to the cerebral cortex. Temperature, when you're touched or when you touch something, all that information, all that sensory information goes to the thalamus and then gets relayed. It also is involved in the perception of these senses like pain, but not the localization of the pain. So your thalamus gives you the perception that you're in pain, but it doesn't know where that pain's coming from. To determine where that pain's coming from, you need your cerebral cortex. We call that cortical processing. That helps you do more of the interpretation and localization of the pain. Other functions the thalamus is involved in: consciousness, some emotional influence. It's involved in learning and memory as well. But again, the number one thing that it's known for is acting as a sensory relay center. The next region of the diencephalon is known as the hypothalamus, and hypo means below. It's located largely below the thalamus, but also a little anterior, as opposed to the epithalamus, which is above but also posterior to the thalamus. The hypothalamus is a region of the brain that you're going to hear a lot about. It does a number of functions in maintaining homeostasis. It's going to help make sure the body does things to keep it hydrated. It makes sure that the body is going to be consuming nutrients, so it has what's called a feeding center. It helps maintain body temperature, so it has an internal thermostat. It helps regulate your circadian rhythms or your night and day cycles. So it's got a number of functions. So what it's known for in general sense is to control many body functions and maintain many homeostatic conditions like hydration, temperature, feeding. There is some behavioral effect emanating from the hypothalamus and emotional responses. It contains what's known as the mammillary bodies. The mammillary bodies help relay smell and taste reflexes. So we do often have a reflex in response to certain tastes and certain smells. Then it also is a major interface between your nervous system and endocrine system. So this organ, the hypothalamus, plays a vital role in both systems. Its nervous system, involving these homeostatic balances, body temperature, eating, drinking. It also connects to the pituitary gland, which is known as your master endocrine organ. So it helps influence your pituitary, which then influences many of your hormones that are produced. So the hypothalamus is going to be revisited in many contexts in A&P2. When we get to hydration, when we get to eating, when we get to body temperature regulation, when we get to fever. So when you have a fever, that's determined by the hypothalamus. But also when we get into all these different hormones that control the body. But it's physically connected to the pituitary gland by a structure called the infundibulum. Unfortunately, this brain is lacking a pituitary gland. Quite often it's difficult to keep that pituitary gland still attached. But when you look at some other pictures, some other drawings, you're going to see a little P-shaped gland projecting down from the hypothalamus. That would be the pituitary. The infundibulum, which means funnel, helps to funnel hormones from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. Because the way the hypothalamus influences the pituitary is largely by hormones. So it produces hormones that control the anterior pituitary, and it sends hormones to the posterior pituitary. This is going to be more of a idea that we'll need to know when we get to the endocrine system, but your pituitary gland has two glands in one. The anterior portion is controlled by the hypothalamus, but the posterior pituitary helps release a couple hormones that it gets from the hypothalamus. Those two hormones include antidiuretic, which helps retain water, and oxytocin, which helps stimulate the uterus during childbirth. So the hypothalamus is one of these parts of the brain that has a lot of jobs in homeostasis, a lot of jobs related to the endocrine system and hormone production. The third area of the diencephalon is the easiest region to remember. It's known as the epithalamus. Epi referring to the fact that it's located kind of above and around the thalamus, but also it has a gland that projects posteriorly. That gland is known as the pineal gland. The pineal gland produces one hormone known as melatonin. Melatonin is involved in our wake-sleep cycle. It plays a more important role at nighttime. So it's produced in darkness. So when you go to sleep at night, when it's dark outside, melatonin levels are going to be on the rise. And then this hormone appears to be involved in helping you go to sleep. Some individuals will take melatonin. They may have insomnia or trouble sleeping. And when it's taken orally, melatonin also appears to contribute to helping induce that sleep for these individuals. It also helps to kind of reset our rhythm. So many individuals will take it in response to jet lag. So to help them kind of reset their biological clock based on changing time, you can take melatonin for that. So that one's fairly easy in the world of the diencephalon. The next video, we're going to talk about the cerebellum, which is known as the small brain, as opposed to the cerebrum, which is this larger area.